Welcome to Wisdom Unveiled. We're back for another deep dive. This is number 33 in our series of 40, focusing entirely on the wisdom of Hafez Shirazi.
That's right. And today we're drawing again from those insightful conversations between Dr. Dinani and Dr. Larijani on the Marifat program.
Wonderful sources. Before we jump in, just a quick reminder. This podcast is a translation and reproduction of those conversations. Some nuances, some details might not translate perfectly.
Yes, and we do apologize in advance for any, potential discrepancies. We always welcome feedback, of course.
Absolutely. So today's focus, it's one specific, really potent verse from Hafez.
A verse that gets right to the heart of something quite, well, puzzling.
It really does. It explores God's nearness, this idea that the divine is always close, but, well, somehow we often fail to see it.
We miss it, even when it's supposedly right there.
So the verse in Farsi is, and a
rough translation would be something like, the unhearted one in every state, God was with him. He did not see him, and from afar he would cry, "Oh God."
That contrast just jumps out, doesn't it? God was with him, yet he's crying out from afar.
Exactly. That's the apparent contradiction we want to unpack today. What does it mean for God to be present yet unseen? What are the implications?
Okay, let's start with that first part, the unhearted one. What does unheartedness mean here, based on how Dr. Dinani and Dr. Larijani discussed it? Is it like being heartless?
No, not really in a moral sense, not lacking emotion or courage. It's more about a lack of spiritual awareness.
Okay, like insight.
Yes, exactly. A failure to perceive the divine presence that, according to the verse, is already there. It describes a state of inner blindness, you could say.
Got it. So it's not a judgment, more a description of a condition. And then the verse states, quite definitively, God was with him.
In every state. That part's crucial.
Right, in every state. It sounds so absolute.
It is. It suggests this divine presence is unconditional. It doesn't depend on whether the person believes or what they're doing. God is just with them.
That reminds me, Dr. Dinani connected this to a Quranic concept, didn't he?
He did, yes.
Yeah.
He mentioned the verse, and he is with you wherever you are. It shows this isn't just Hafez's idea. It resonates with Scripture. God's presence is universal, constant.
And wasn't there something even more intense, closer than?
Closer than the jugular vein. That image really emphasizes the intimacy, the idea that God is nearer to us than perhaps even our own selves.
Wow, so presence isn't even the right word. It's deeper than that.
It suggests an inseparable reality.
Okay, so if God is that close in every state, how can the second line be true? He did not see him, and from afar he would cry, "Oh God."
Well, that's the paradox. The philosophers frame it as objective nearness, but subjective blindness.
Okay, break that down.
Objectively, fundamentally, based on the first line and those scriptural ideas, God is near. That's the reality.
Right, but subjectively, from the perspective of the unhearted person's awareness, there's blindness. They lack the inner perception, the spiritual sight, to recognize that nearness.
So the feeling of distance, the crying out from afar, stems from this lack of recognition.
Precisely. It's born from the subjective feeling of separation, even though objectively intimacy exists. It's like being thirsty while standing in a river, but somehow not realizing the water is all around you.
That's a powerful image. Now, let's refine this idea of God being with someone. Dr. Larijani was careful to explain it's not like physical co-location, right? Not like two things side by side.
Exactly. He made a distinction. He talked about presence along the length versus in the breadth.
Length and breadth, how does that work?
Think of in the breadth as things existing next to each other in space, like you and me sitting here.
Okay.
But God's presence along the length is different. It means God is the underlying reality, the sustaining principle of existence itself. Not just alongside creation, but the very foundation, the source from which it arises and is maintained. So God isn't just with the table. He's the reality that allows the table to be.
That's a good way to put it. Dr. Larijani used examples like that. God is with the table, but is not the table. With the sea, but not just the sea. It points to that deeper foundational presence.
There was a philosophical principle mentioned too, something about the simple reality.
Ah, yes. Al-basit al-hakika kula asha walaisa bishayin minya. It sounds complex, but the idea is that the ultimate simple reality God is, in essence, all things, the truth of all things.
But isn't identical to any single one of them.
Exactly. God encompasses everything without being limited to being any specific thing within creation, present in and as the reality of all things, but transcending them all.
That is mind-bending. Okay, so God is always with us in this fundamental way. But what about us being with God? Is that relationship symmetrical?
That's a crucial point. No, it's not symmetrical in terms of our awareness or orientation. God's presence is constant, objective.
Even, say, with someone who actively denies God, an atheist.
Yes, Dr. Larijani specifically mentioned this. God is objectively with the disbeliever. The divine reality sustains their very existence. But the disbeliever's heart, their inner focus, isn't turned towards God. They aren't consciously with God.
So the awareness, the turning towards, that's on our side.
That's where the striving comes in. The value lies in our conscious effort to align our inner state, our awareness, with the reality that's already present, to become consciously with the God who is already with us.
Which brings us back to Hafez. Nearness and distance aren't physical. They're states of the heart, the mind, our inner orientation.
Precisely. It highlights why intention is so important in spiritual practice. It's about consciously directing the self towards that ever-present divine reality.
So what stops the unhearted person from seeing? What creates this subjective blindness, this perceived distance? Dr. Dinani mentioned the prison of the mind. Haven't you?
Yes, the prison of crooked thinking, or perhaps delusions might be closer. It refers to mental rigidity, stubbornness, clinging to flawed assumptions or preconceived notions.
How does that act like a prison?
It locks us into a limited view of reality. It prevents us from seeing the truth, in this case, the truth of God's nearness, even if it's right there. It's a self-imposed confinement built from our own flawed thinking.
And what fuels this prison?
Often it's ego, in self-centeredness, being overly invested in our own limited perspective. It makes us resist anything that challenges our fixed ideas.
And this connects to an even deeper idea. They discussed the covenant of Alast. Sufism knew.
A very profound concept, yes. It refers to the Quranic narrative where, before creation as we know it, God gathered all potential souls and asked, Alastu bi rabbikum, am I not your Lord?
And the response?
Qalu bala. They said yes.
So this is like a primordial agreement.
Dr. Dinani emphasized that this yes wasn't spoken by our everyday limited consciousness. It was an affirmation made by our intra, our innate disposition, our primordial nature, our pure intellect. It's an inherent recognition deep within our being.
So it's not a memory we recall, but a state of being.
Exactly. It's an eternal reality within us, not just a past event. That inherent yes is always there. It's part of our fundamental makeup.
So the unhearted person in Hafez's verse, their blindness isn't because that deep inherent yes is gone.
No, the covenant and the level of being remains. The failure to see God now, in their current state, is because that innate recognition is obscured.
Obscured by what?
By the prison of the mind, by the veils of ego, desire, attachment, the things that cloud our perception. The inherent yes is covered over, so to speak.
That makes sense. It's not a broken promise at the core, but a clouded vision on the surface. They also brought in the story of Samiri from the Quran, didn't they? How does that fit?
Right, the story of Moses and Samiri and the golden calf. Dr. Dinani used Samiri as a symbol. Samiri performed a kind of magic of creating an illusion, something that looked real, the golden calf that seemed low, but had no true substance.
Unlike Moses' miracles, which were seen as divine acts, real transformations.
Precisely. Samiri represents being engrossed in falsehood, in appearances, and perhaps most importantly, engrossed in the self. Dr. Dinani interpreted Samiri as being a prisoner of himself. Koshtan-e.
So trapped in his own ego and illusions. How does that connect back to Hafez's unhearted one?
The connection is that the unhearted one is also, in a way, trapped in their subjective blindness, perhaps preoccupied with their own mental magic, their illusions, their ego, and thus unable to see the true reality of God's presence. Like Samiri, they are focused on the wrong thing.
So the struggle between Moses, representing truth, connection to the divine, and Samiri, representing illusion, self-absorption, is an ongoing internal battle.
Yes, Dr. Dinani suggested it happens within each person and within society. Being oriented towards truth, speaking truth, is like Moses. Being focused on the self, on illusion, is like Samiri.
This leads to another challenging concept they discussed related to that story, the command to the Israelites after the golden calf incident. Kill yourselves. That sounds drastic.
It does. But Dr. Dinani offered a crucial interpretation based on mystical and philosophical traditions. It doesn't mean physical suicide.
What does it mean then?
It means killing the nafs, the lower self, the egoistic self. Specifically, the animalistic self, the base desires, the ego-driven impulses that led them astray towards the calf in the first place.
So it's a metaphorical death, a transformation.
Exactly. It's about sacrificing the lower nature for the sake of the higher human spiritual potential. Think of sacrifice Sokyu in this light. It's symbolically letting go of that animalistic part of us.
Is that connected to the practice of saying Bismillah, in the name of God, before slaughtering an animal for food?
Yes, Dr. Dinani drew that parallel, saying Bismillah acknowledges that even this act, taking an animal life for sustenance, should be done with a higher purpose, symbolically linked to sacrificing one's own lower desires in the name of God. It elevates the act beyond mere killing.
So killing the self is really about overcoming the ego, the very thing that creates the blindness in Hafez's verse.
Precisely. It's about removing the obstacles within.
What are those obstacles often called? Didn't they use the term hawa?
Yes, so I've often translated as vain desires, caprice, or ego. It acts like dust settling on the mirror of the heart.
And if the mirror is dusty?
It can't reflect the reality, the truth of God's nearness. Removing that dust, that Ashen, through spiritual discipline, through killing the self in that metaphorical sense, allows the heart's mirror to become clear.
And when the mirror is clear, what happens? Does the distinction between the self and the divine blur?
That's where it leads, towards the concept of unity of existence. When the veils of ego and illusion are sufficiently removed, the perceived separation between I, you, and he, God, starts to dissolve.
Is that related to Mansour al-Hallaj's famous cry, Ana al-Haq, I am the truth?
Exactly. That statement is often understood as arising from such a state of unveiled realization where the individual consciousness perceives its ultimate identity within the divine reality. It's a consequence of the mirror being perfectly clear.
It all seems to point inward then. Even finding the world-revealing cup the Susi Sa Hafez often speaks of.
The idea is that, in a profound sense, it's already within us. The journey isn't primarily about going somewhere else, but about clearing the inner obstacles to see what's already inherent in our own being and in reality itself.
Looking outward, but from an inner clarity, with the light of the inner self.
That's the goal, to perceive the world through that cleared mirror, reflecting the divine light.
So the key takeaway here, listening to Dinani and Larijani unpack this verse, seems to be, well, despite God's constant, intimate presence,
Our own internal state, our level of awareness, the prisons we build in our minds, the dominance of ego, that's what often prevents us from actually perceiving that reality.
it really puts the onus back on us, on our inner work.
It does. The nearness is given. The perception requires effort.
So maybe a point of reflection for everyone listening. How might just knowing this, intellectually accepting the possibility of this inherent nearness, change how you view those times you feel distant from the divine?
Could recognizing the nearness is objective, while the distance is subjective, shift the perspective?
And perhaps a final thought to mull over. If we have this inherent yes within us from the covenant of Alast, what happens if we consciously try to attune ourselves to that and actively work on clearing away that dust of ego? How might that transform not just moments, but our whole experience of life and connection?
A deep question. How does life change when perceived through a cleaner mirror?
Indeed. And this was just scratching the surface of one verse by Hafez. It shows the incredible depth there.
Truly endless layers.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive on Wisdom Unveiled. And again, our reminder, this podcast is a translation and reproduction of conversations with Iranian philosophers like Dr. Ebrahim Dinani and Dr. Esmail Mansouri Larijani.
That's right. Some concepts or details may not be fully conveyed in translation. We apologize for any potential discrepancies.
Your feedback is always welcome. We hope you'll join us for future explorations into the wisdom of Hafez.